In this video, I'm going to take you through the process of modification of a UCBL FO, which is a device prescribed for someone who requires the control of midfoot and the high foot. Here with me I have a mold which was taken a few days ago, and as you can see, I have all the landmarks. That were taken from the time of casting. First step of modification begins with the evaluation of the positive mold. So first we need to lay down the positive mold on the flat surface. So once we lay the cast down on a flat surface, we need to check if the cast is stable. Okay, and then we check for the whether or not the midline of the calcaneus is vertical. So as you can see here, the line is perfectly vertical. Next, we check whether or not the forefoot and the heel, they are parallel. So in this case, as you can see, they are quite parallel. So just only a small cluster smoothing or small cluster reduction, then it should be perfect. So we have already checked the alignment in the coronal plane. So next, let's look at the alignment in the sagittal plane. So here, what we want to see whether or not the heel and the forefoot is matching with the shoe profile. By that I mean if the shoe has any heel height, so you would see this heel height and forefoot contouring or forefoot conformations to the flat surface. But in this case, the cast was taken from the patient, and the patient will not be using any shoe with a heel height, so we're gonna go with the flat base. After checking the alignments in both coronal and sagittal plane, we move on to checking the measurement of the plaster mold. So the first measurement I'm taking is the foot length, and then mid of at the metatarsal head, the diameter at the tarsal head. So the measurement at the sustentacular is important if you want to have a good grip of the calcaneus. And measure the diameter of the heel base. This is quite important. You don't want it to be so small, but you want to provide enough room for the tissue during the loading, because the tissue at the base of the heel spreads a little bit upon loading. Another measurement to be taken would be the distance from the first mat head to the fifth mat head. So you do that by placing the measurement tape at the apex of the first mat head. You run the tape across the heel all the way to the fifth mat head. Okay, so this can tell you whether or not the location of the mark that you're marking is in the correct location, the same as the time that you took the cast, or the mark is shifted or changed during the time of the wrapping. Note all the alignment and measurement differences so that you know what adjustment needs to be made. So now we can begin to reduce all the irregularity on the cast. Remember that during the process of cleaning up the irregularity, be sure not to remove any landmark. And if you accidentally remove part of the landmark, then be sure to remark them so that you still have them as a reference. Because we cannot afford to lose any landmark that we obtained during the time of the casting. I'm not worried too much with the front part of the cast, because if you're going to go for full length foot plate, you're going to extend the cast by 2 cm for the relief of the toe. If in this case I would love to go for the metatarsal lens, so I'm not so worried about the front at the moment. After cleaning up the irregularity, we can begin to take down the calcaneus or the heel to the measurement. So the measurement at the heel base has to be the same as the patient's measurement. If your cast is larger, then you will need to reduce the plaster from either side of the calcaneus. Now, there are a few things that to remember. If the calcaneus is neutral, as you could see in this case, the calcaneus is vertical, is neutral, and then equal amount of plaster need to be reused on each side so that you achieve the same measurement as the patient. If the calcaneus is in inverted position, then more plaster will need to be reused on the lateral side compared to the medial side. In the case that the calcaneus is inverted, then more plaster will need to be reused on the medial side compared to the lateral side. The idea is to make sure that you obtain a vertical calcaneus and the same measurement as the patient's. After we adjust the measurement of the heel base, then we can move on to taking away a small amount of plaster at the heel so that we can have a flat heel surface. This will make your UCBL stable during when it sits on the surface. So now you will see that the heel is flat. Another point to note here is also to ensure that the shape of the heel is rounded and not square. So next, we need to work on the width of the metatarsal head. We don't want it to be too large. We don't want it to be too small. If it is too large, it will spread the shoe at that area, which will damage the shoe in the long term. And if it is too small, it will create an edge pressure on the both metatarsal head area of the foot, which is something that we do not want. So we need to take it down to the same measurement as the measurement chart. After you adjust the measurement of the metatarsal head, next we're going to flatten the mat head area all the way to the front of the toe. Remember that we want this area to be parallel to the heel, so that it will create a stable base for your UCBL device. As you can see earlier, that I already achieved this part parallel, so I do not need a big modifications. Another thing to note is that in the sagittal plane, remember that it has to be matching the shoe profile. If the patient is using 1 cm heel height, be sure to put a block of the same heel height underneath the heel, and then the mat head will be in full contact with the flat surface, and if necessary, take away the material underneath the toes so that you can obtain the sagittal profile of the UCBL to match with the patient's shoe. Next, we can begin to modify the medial longitudinal arch. And how we do that is, first we need to divide the calcaneus into 3 portions. So here you can see that this is the side of the calcaneus all the way to the back. So this is 6 centimeter that I have right here. So I'm gonna divide it into 3 portions. And by the way, this modification of the medial arch is the same for any AFO modification, either solid AFO, articulated AFO, or the PLS AFO. So the modification of the arch are just the same. So we divide the calcaneus into 3 portions, and then we will reduce the plaster from 1/3 of the calcaneus all the way to the first mat head, right behind the first mat head. So that will be the plaster that we need to reuse. Now, if you recall your anatomy, the medial arch consists of the first 3 metatarsal bones. So here, if you follow along with me, So this will be the fourth and fifth, and will be the first, the second, and the third. So we need to capture the medial arch from here, from the first three metatarsal bone. Okay. You can start blending the plaster from the front 1/3 of the calcaneus all the way to the area just proximal to the first metatarsal head. A small plaster is used over there, small plaster is used over here, but more plaster can be used under this area, under the navicular, because this area, if you have a good amount of plaster reduction from there, it can prevent the calcaneus from going into everted position. So this will be the highest point of your medial arch, and then we can blend plaster all the way from here and there. And the height of our arch would be at the navicular. So this will be the area of the reduction, but more plaster is taken away from this area. And remember that you want to obtain the shape of the medial arch from the time of casting, rather than just trying to have all the reduction done during the time of modification, because it can take a lot amount of time for the modification, and sometimes you might overcorrect the arch. So my advice is to obtain a good shape of the arch from the time of casting. So if you already have a good shape of the arch, then just a small plaster reduction like this, then it should be okay. As you could see, I did not reuse anything beyond this line, but just only a small plaster blending over there. So this is nice and smooth. Okay, if you feel the natural contour of the foot, then it's most of the time it is correct. So once you're done with the modification of the medial arch, and then we can begin modifying the lateral arch. Again, it is taken from the front 1/3 of the calcaneus all the way to the area just proximal to the fifth med head. Now, if you can recall your anatomy, the lateral longitudinal arch, they are quite low compared to the medial arch. So just only a small plaster reduction or blending is needed in this area, not a whole lot of plaster to be taken away. Okay, so when you do that, you blend to the front of the calcaneus, like this. So you want to reduce a small plaster between the base and the head of the metatarsal bones, for the control of the midfoot over there. Remember that the lateral longitudinal arch needs to be blended with the medial longitudinal arch. So you should feel a small contour or a small blend between the two arches. In some cases, the metatarsal dome is required. So I'm going to show you how that can be done in this modification. Before we move on to the modification of the metatarsal dome, let me tell you one thing. In the manual, as the guideline, it says the depth of the dome should be 1 cm, and it should appear under the area between the second and the third metatarsal. But that's not always the case. Sometimes you have a child patient and an adult patient, so it should not be 1 centimeter all the time. But for my practice, during the time of casting, I use my thumb to press underneath that area, and then so that I can really see how much plaster reaction I can obtain from that time. And it also helped me as a guideline to know how far the shape should be. So during the time of casting, I place my thumb underneath the second and the third metatarsal bones. Then you already get a good grip for the contour, the shape of this area. And then at the same time, I also know how much I can push underneath that part, just to make sure that the patient feel comfortable with that push. And then it gives me a sense of how much plaster that needs to be released from that area. So this line right here is what I got from the time of casting. I palpate for the first med head, like here, the second, and then the third, the fourth, and the fifth. So we have it like that. Now the dome is between the second and the fourth. Okay. Now the distance would be all the way to the base of the fifth. You do not want the border of the dome to be right on the head, because it can create the pressure. So we want to stay just proximal to the head, and then our deepest point in between the second and the third metatarsal bone. So it is right here. From the border is about 1 cm. That would be the deepest point of the dome. Now remember that this is the area where you reduce more plaster. Less plaster is reduced on the lateral side, and less plaster is reduced down here. So most of the plaster will be reduced on this concentrated area. Less plaster, less and less. So it's just the blend over there. The modification in this area requires special tool. But if you don't have that in your workplace, you can also use the hacksaw blades. You bend it over so that it forms like an arch like this. So remember that the deepest point is in this area, and then everywhere else you can just kind of blend it. Blend the plaster. So while doing that, keep checking whether you feel that you have the same feeling with your thumb as the time of your casting. So this looks good to me. So then I can just smooth and blend the plaster to ensure that it is nice and smooth and round. We move on to plaster adhesion. So usually the plaster adhesion happens at the base of the fifth metatarsal bones. The head of the fifth metatarsal bones, if you want to go with the full length. In this case, I'm going with the metatarsal length, so I am not going to be worried about building up this area. But you will have to do that if you do the full length. On the medial side, you will need to make a build up on the first metatarsal head. Again, if you want to go with full length, in this case I'm not worried about that. But you might want to add a small plaster here, just to kind of giving flair to the navicula, because you do not want your trim line to have any pressure on the navicular bone. Now the build up on the base of the metatarsal bones is usually between 2 to 3 millimeter, and you can always use the ruler stick to check that. Okay? So this is about 3 millimeter right there. I'm going to take it down a little bit. Same here for the navicula. I'm going to do just 2 millimeter there. use the ruler to see this 2 millimeter right there. It's good. So then we can mix a small amount of plaster and build up. Please remember to not add any plaster beyond the border or beyond the mark that you have, because you do not want to create unnecessary gaps over there. And the plaster build up should be concentrated on the apex. That would be the highest point, and then everything else can just be blended between the front and back after build up. I mentioned in another video that you can also use the ink. You can mix some ink with the plaster, so it will give you different colors. That's something for someone who want to differentiate between the original plaster and the plaster build-up. Do not wait until the plaster is completely dry, because it's going to make it hard for the modification. So use a wire mesh to clean the build-up. Once you see the head of the nail, you would want to stop at the center, but then try to blend or smooth the area in the front and at the back. It's good. Then I move on to the picture. Keep sanding the plaster until you see the nail head. Fill up this plaster here just to make it look nice and so I'm just covering the uneven surface right here just to make my cast look nice. You can have the sense to tell if this cast is for the left leg, the left foot, or the right foot. Now, one thing you might want to stay away is the unnecessary plaster on the top surface, because when you do the thermoforming, you're gonna lay this one onto the vacuum post, so you want it to sit nice and flat. You don't want it to be rocking. Begin smoothing off our build-up. You see that I did specifically mention that all the modification, you need to follow the recommended step, so that it will save you time during modification, and it also makes your work more organized. So avoid jumping between the plaster reduction and the plaster build-up. This way will save you time. To do another checking of the alignment and the overall shape of your plaster mold. Again, we look at the whether or not the calcaneus is vertical. Sometimes during the process of the smoothing, blending plaster, you might take away some plaster which cause the alteration of the overall alignment. So it's better to check it again whether or not the calcaneus is still vertical. And then in the sagittal plane, is it stable? Both the heel and the forefoot. Okay. We see if the contour of the cast following the shoe profile, as I mentioned earlier. If the shoe is 1 cm high, put a 1 cm block underneath the heel and then check it. In this case, the patient wear the shoe without the heel high sandal. So this is looks good for me in that sense. Also look at the medial side and see if there's a smooth contour of the medial arch. So once you're happy with the overall alignment, you can begin finishing up your cast. Use the wire mesh and start smoothing all around the cast. Some people would prefer to use water during the smoothing so that the cast looks nice and smooth. But there's also a setback on that one. If you use too much if you use too much water, the water content, the cast will be soaked, will be moisture, and that can affect the quality of the plastic thermoforming, because remember that the plastic needs to be heated all the way to 180 degrees, and all of a sudden the plastic is laid on the moisture plaster, so it's not a good practice. So if you do use a lot of plaster for the smoothing, I recommend that you dry up your cast. Give it a good amount of time so that the plaster is dry before you start molding. Or you can apply any separating agent like the varnish. So the varnish can be applied all around the cast, and it will it acts as a seal between the moisture cast and the hot plastic. I just realized that there's a small pore here and a pore over there, so I'm gonna fill them up, because I do not want any plastic to be stuck into the pore. So now that I have already filled them up, so our plaster mold is ready for thermoforming by the technician. Just one thing before I send the cast to the technician, I need to draw my trim line as a guide for the technician to work on. Okay? So if you recall, the trim line for the UCBL is underneath the medial malleolus is right here. And then on the lateral side, it is underneath the lateral malleolus, and this is the mark for the lateral malleolus that I have. So the trim line is going to be coming right there. I always want to leave a good trim line, because I can always trim it back during the time of fitting. It's better to have more material rather than less materials. So I'm going to keep it right there. Then you can blend coming down to just proximal to the head of the fifth metatarsal, like this one here. Running just on the edge of the navicular, and then coming down to the area just proximal to the first metatarsal head, and then this is the height of my dome right here. This is the trim line. So this will conclude our modification of the UCBL foot orthosis. Thank you for watching.